Good afternoon. My name is Maryam Deloffre, and I'm the director of the Humanitarian Action Initiative and associate professor of international affairs at the George Washington University. I'm so pleased to welcome you to our panel discussion, Who Defines Humanitarianism? Challenging the International Imaginary of Aid. On this panel, we explore the global emergency imaginary, how we think about, narrate, and frame what constitutes a humanitarian emergency, what it means to be a humanitarian, and what it means to do humanitarian work. Humanitarian action is imagined to be politically neutral and impartial, delivered by international organizations and conceived as short-term responses to urgent exceptional crises. Our guests, Carruth and Hugo Slim, challenge this conventional imaginary and offer new understandings of what it means to do humanitarian work. Carruth is a medical anthropologist and teaches global health and humanitarian response at American University's School of International Service. Her research focuses on 5 themes: labor and inequity within the humanitarian industry, irregular labor migrations between Ethiopia and Gulf states, the relationship between food insecurity, medical insecurity, and diabetes, nutritional wasting in emergencies and the development of therapeutic foods, and emerging zoonotic diseases in the Horn of Africa. Today, we will discuss Dr. Carruth's 2021 book, Love and Liberation, Humanitarian Work in Ethiopia's Somali Region, which was published by Cornell University Press. Welcome, Dr. Carruth. Hugo Slim is the Senior Research Fellow at the La Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford, and also at the Institute of Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict at Oxford's Blatvanik School of Government. His career has combined academia, policymaking, and diplomacy, and he has worked for Save the Children, the United Nations, Oxfam Great Britain, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, CAFAD, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Today, he will discuss his most recent book, Solferino 29, Warfare, Civilians, and Humanitarians in 21st Century. Each panelist will provide a brief overview of their books, and then I will discuss both, putting the 2 books in conversation and drawing out main points of synergy. We will then open to audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We thought we would begin with Hugo Slim's book because it provides a broad overview of the history of humanitarianism to the present day, and then we'll continue with Dr. Carruth's book because it takes a deep dive into a specific context of humanitarian action. Hugo, I'll pass it over to you.
Brilliant, Maryam, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming to this. And it's a real pleasure to present my book alongside Lauren's, I think, much more important book from her experience in the Somali region of Ethiopia. And I was suddenly thinking, when I was there, and I think I first went to Jijiga, which she writes about, in 1985 when I was with Save the Children. And then the only time I went to Gode, which is another place where she writes about her book, was I think in 2001 when I was evaluating ICRC down there. And it's an area that's fascinated me and stayed with me always. So it's a pleasure to be sharing this panel with you, Lauren. So, and it was very good to read your book too. And naturally, I wished I'd read it before I wrote mine, because much of the texture you give about the localization debate and everything in humanitarian aid would have helped me a lot. So, my book, Solferino 21. So this was a book that was meant to be written from the ground up like Lauren's, but couldn't be. I was meant to go to a couple of, to Iraq and Nigeria and Yemen and write the book from the ground up, looking at war today and the aid world today. But COVID meant that, in fact, it was a book written with a view on war and humanitarian aid from Oxford. So not quite what we'd hoped, but I hope it's useful nonetheless. And the plot of the book is really that I was asked to write it by several Red Cross societies and the ICRC to mark the 160th anniversary of Henri Dunant's A Memory of Solferino, which of course was his classic text in which he sort of launched a manifesto for the Red Cross movement, for the Geneva Conventions, and for the whole form of humanitarianism that became the sort of Swiss model of humanitarianism. So I did that, and I looked at three things. I looked at warfare today and then into the future, and I looked at civilians today and into the future slightly, and I looked at humanitarians today and into the future. So it's like a triptych with those three sections. And I think it makes most sense in terms of our question today of who defines humanitarianism. I think it makes most sense if I focus on part 3 of the book, which is about humanitarians. And so if we look at our question, who defines humanitarianism, my book would suggest, and the history I tell would suggest, that it is largely the West which defines humanitarianism internationally today, and therefore nationally as well. And I think that the point I'd like to start with is that this form of international humanitarianism has been an extraordinary achievement. It saved millions of lives and supported millions of lives over that period. And actually you hear that coming out of the testimony in Lauren's book too, that it does change lives and save lives in many ways. So to recognize from the outset that that contribution of the West emerging out of Western wars and going out into the wider world is an extraordinary ethical and operational and legal achievement of collective action between states and between many, many organizations. But it still means that humanitarianism as we have it today has been mainly defined by the West as a project of liberal internationalism, even if it's been informed in crucial ways by great Asians and Latin, I can think of Amartya Sen and Muhammad Yunus, Sen's work on famine and Yunus's work on cash, which were both pioneering, have really informed the shape of Western aid today. And increasingly, the former president of Brazil, Lula's work on social protection, that is also influencing aid. But essentially the structure, the power, as Lauren's book tells so well as well, is profoundly Western, and it grew out of European wars, and it particularly grew out of that Dunant moment in 1859, where he had his idea to formalize humanitarian aid in law and in practice and institutionally. But, Lauren's book talks about myths and origin myths, and there is an origin myth around Dunant. He's not the sole founder of humanitarianism at all. He's one founder. And my book looks at humanitarians today and finds they have many ancestors. And in a way, the pivotal moment was World War I, where, and I'm talking to an American university, so perhaps the single greatest Western humanitarian ever is, funnily enough, Herbert Hoover, who's a pretty discredited president, but was the most extraordinary humanitarian, born a Quaker in poverty in America. And his work in World War I and then on into the aftermath of World War I and into the Russian Revolution, his food aid work was phenomenal and really, in a sense, is the main founder of humanitarianism today and the big agencies like World Food Programme and others. But then in World War I, we also have Save the Children, Eglantine Jebb, creating and internationalizing an ideal of the child, and then in a sense, internationally inventing childhood as well. The Spanish Civil War creates Plan International, World War II creates Oxfam, the International Rescue Committee, CARE, and then of course the Korean War, World Vision, the Biafran War, MSF, and the Ethiopian famine, Islamic Relief up the road from me in Birmingham. So there are many ancestors other than Dunant, and they each bring with them a particular approach and innovation of some kind. And of course, after World War I, we have the League of Nations agencies, and after World War II, we have the UN agencies. So all these institutions, their founders, their innovations, emerging from European conflict, are really defining humanitarianism over the 20th century and into the 21st century, because they maintain their grip on the system, and Western or OECD countries largely finance that system. And there's always been two traditions of humanitarian aid: the formal, neutral, the form of humanitarian aid which works with state consent. And there's also always been a second tradition, which is informal. It's politically committed to one side of a conflict, or to justice more generally, social justice more generally. It works in solidarity with a cause, a people, as we're seeing in a lot of Ukrainian humanitarianism today. And it works with a liberationist agenda, not a rather conservative humanitarian state-centric agenda. And we can look back at even the creation of the International Rescue Committee, IRC, which is in a sense one of the most formal and respectable and agencies today. But of course, it was a radical liberationist agency of rescue when it started, working against state consent where it was, and working covertly very often. After that, we had a lot of anti-apartheid humanitarianism with the frontline states and Christian solidarity and other radical leftist solidarity agencies supporting humanitarian aid in support of that struggle. We saw that against Latin American dictators as well. And in the independence struggles of Eritrea, South Sudan, and the Tigrayan movement for liberation as well. So those two traditions exist, but in my lifetime and in the 1990s, one tradition really swallowed up the other. So the formal, neutral Swiss model, as I tend to call it, won out. And in the 90s onwards, all the Anglo-Saxon relief communities, all the church communities, and the UN were converted to the Swiss principled model of humanitarian aid, adopting the Red Cross, Red Crescent principles from 1965, which were agreed by the movement in 65, especially those humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, the core four. So that's really the world we're still in. And now in a way, we're all semi-defining ourselves or defined as Red Cross type humanitarians, formal, neutral, working with state consent, dodging the politics and trying to find this mystical thing that Lauren writes about as well, called humanitarian space, where you can do what you like to help people, and people agree, as do not hope they would, that you are above the conflict in some way. The other thing I think that's happened in the last 20 years, particularly, and I argue about this in the book, is not only in the sense that we all been swallowed up by the Swiss model of Red Cross, Red Crescent humanitarianism. The last 20 years has also seen an intense elaboration of humanitarian aid as that elite, global, largely Western funded, Western led system of agencies defines and redefines and elaborates humanitarian aid even more. So in a way, looking at humanitarianism today, you see a movement, a global movement that is really bizarrely utopian. And it's trying to redefine itself as relevant to realizing every human right and meeting every human need. So it's an extraordinary extension of ambition and elaboration. And just to say how I look at those, I look at maybe sort of 5 areas of elaboration. The first one is that, you know, in the last 20 years, my generation and the new generations of humanitarians have elaborated the principle of humanity itself to move from a sort of meta-identity that we are all human beings and therefore should be saved and cherished and respected as precious human beings, to a notion of diverse humanity, much more preoccupied with the micro-identities of our humanity than with the big meta-identity. And so we see a form of diverse humanity which is trying to be incredibly granular and identify and respond to every different nuance, and this is sort of intersectionality as well, if you like, of gender, race, the colors we are, the experiences we are, whether we're digitally connected or not, whether we're rural or urban, whether we're able or disabled or differently abled, this incredible commitment to try and find everybody's individual particular humanity, whereas in fact the movement before was much more concerned with establishing an overall humanity in which we could all share. Now we're trying to break that down and show how we're all different in our humanity, and therefore aid needs to become incredibly elaborate and meet us each in our heightened nano-individuality, if you like. So that's the first form of elaboration, which is making aid incredibly complicated and defining it in the sort of highly nuanced terms of Western welfarism, Western liberal welfarism. The second is really elaborating needs. So, you know, the sort of early humanitarian core needs of food, water, shelter, health, and family contact are really broadening out, so that education is a humanitarian need. Protection of all kinds, of all rights, is a humanitarian need. Mental health is as much a humanitarian need as physical health, and social protection is a need as well. So this big elaboration of the field as these more powerful Western agencies redefine what it is to give aid and what aid is right and correct as humanitarian. The third elaboration is around time, because humanitarians have decided that they need to be around for a long time, so they've extended their time horizon and elaborated their programming to say we must do sustainable aid, we must be accompanying people over the long term in protracted conflicts, in climate crisis. Therefore, we must do what I call in the book long aid. And many humanitarians, and in the public imagination, people think they're working short term to look after people quickly in crisis, are into their second or third decade of working with the same displaced community or around the same rural community, etc. So in a way, we've all become the Red Cross and as a sort of defined Swiss humanitarianism, and now we're all becoming UNRWA, because we're all working for decades with the same communities as their core sort of welfare state in substitution. And the fourth thing, therefore, is that we are, or the humanitarian movement as such, is beginning to try and globalize welfare. And it's taking a lot of the development space and saying we can do all this globalizing welfare in these strange areas called fragile states. So we will lead as much as the development people on global welfare. And then, of course, the fifth thing, and it's an environment I've never been very good in, is that all this involves the huge elaboration of bureaucracy. And humanitarian bureaucracies have been elaborated enormously. So, you know, in a sense, when I started in 1983, we might define, humanitarians would define themselves as small, agile, entrepreneurial, quite radical groups of voluntarist type people. Today, humanitarians have defined themselves as huge transnational institutions of great importance with, and here's a dig at my countrymen, salaries for their chief execs of $1 million and huge elaborate bureaucratic structures designed to last for decades like a government department. So that's the elaboration I see, and that is in a sense how humanitarianism is defining itself and defining its project in the last 20 years. And of course, that's been done by this Western club I talk about in the book. So if we were to look at how humanitarianism is defined today by the global Western establishment, it is profoundly international. It is principled according with the Red Cross principles. It is extremely elaborate in its ambition to help people to an enormous degree in their various aspects of their lives, and it is there forever. It's not a sort of come and go thing. It's here as part of the global response to suffering and poverty forever. So my book, in contrast, is a strong call for this system now to look at itself again and redefine itself. And I suppose the main call I make to change humanitarianism and redefine it again is a bottom-up call, much as Lauren will be making as well. And I talk about the need for humanitarian self-determination, the fact that aid has got to be stopped being so international, so imperial, as I describe it in the book, and it's got to respect humanitarian self-determination by different cultures, different governments, different societies, so they define how they're going to work, what their priorities are, and what their principles are as well in many ways. So it's about building national and local institutions and de-internationalizing humanitarianism. Therefore, it's about creating a system of systems and not trying to globalize the Western system as the single system for humanitarian aid, which I think is what a lot of the people in Geneva and New York would like to do. But that's a profoundly imperialist ambition. And I also make the case for simple aid. I think the vested interest of bureaucracies is to complicate and complicate and complicate again, so that they extend their teams, they build their rationale, and they do a lot of job sustainability for themselves. In fact, I think we need to return the system to some sort of simplicity and really seek out simplicity in the way we accompany people, help people, and put power into their hands. And therefore, I think the huge challenge today, and I'll stop with this, is that as we define humanitarianism again, we need to find a much better and politically just balance between international humanitarian power and local, national, self-determined humanitarian power and citizenship-based humanitarian power of the very kind that Lauren writes so well about. Thank you.
Wow, so that was excellent timing. Thank you so much, Dr. Slim. And now we'll hear from Dr. Carruth.
Thanks so much. And I can't say how honored I am to be here today. And I really look forward to the dialogue. So what I want to do actually is talk about my book a little bit. And in order to do so, I want to have a PowerPoint for just a little while and then come off it to have more of a discussion so we can see some maps and images and the like. So I'm going to try to share my screen. But doesn't do that. There it is. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah. So I want to talk about my book, which is Love and Liberation. It's about humanitarian work in the Somali region of Ethiopia. And this, I sort of designed it as an ethnographic study of the global humanitarian system. But sort of rather than centering it, I think as I had for many years as a student of humanitarian policy and humanitarian studies, I wanted to try to center it in the Somali region of Ethiopia, you know, in a part of the world where humanitarian crises and humanitarian responses recur, where humanitarian actors are a really important part of local economies and local politics. And so this became sort of a way for me to do a study of a lot of the things that Dr. Slim is talking about. A study of localization, of liberation movements, like the decolonization of the Horn of Africa, the decolonization of Ethiopia, from the perspective of the Somalis who are carrying it out. So that was my idea. And I want to thank you for having this discussion about, like, what do we imagine as humanitarianism? And I think sort of being trained in it, in the sort of traditional Western field of humanitarian studies, I came away with the stories of Dunant, which I talk about, which are, you know, inspiring on the one hand and very familiar on another hand. You have these images of Europeans and North Americans sort of parachuting in, sort of for brief periods of time, maybe a few months, maximum a few years, to offer assistance. But when I got a job, first for the World Food Program and then for UNICEF in the Horn of Africa, and I began sort of visiting the places where there were relief distributions, this isn't the image that I saw for the most part. It was very rare that people like me were showing up in Jigjiga or Gode or other places. In fact, you know, this is the imagery that I saw, and that was the sort of dominant, most common sort of image of humanitarianism, which is people from crisis-affected countries and communities caring about each other, both during relief operations and for the most part, between relief operations or in the aftermath of relief operations. And I became interested in sort of investigating, well, if this is sort of most of what humanitarianism is today, then what constitutes it? What's really important about it? And I got a PhD in anthropology, in medical anthropology, and we're taught sort of methodologically to try to, sit with people for long periods of time and get to know them and, learn their language, learn to speak with them on their own terms, learn about history, long history, as well as recent history, and, try to understand what makes humanitarian response sort of meaningful to them. And it was that sort of project that led me to write this book eventually. And, you can never sort of divorce yourself entirely from, who you are. I could never sort of become a Somali aid worker, for example. I was always going to be an expat, sort of flying in temporarily. I lived there for a year. I've taken my family there numerous times. We've stayed there a lot, but I could always leave. And I always had sort of opportunities within relief organizations that the Somalis that I saw didn't have. And so I couldn't truly divorce myself or truly sort of be in their shoes. But I tried to learn as much as I could about humanitarianism as they articulated it and as they practiced it every day. So one of the findings that I had as part of this study, and I go into this in the book in much greater detail than I'll do here, is that the international humanitarian system is made possible by a really inequitable and racialized labor hierarchy. And, there are a lot of studies that talk about the, nearly 600,000 relief workers around the world. And this diagram here, it sort of reveals that somewhere, according to ALNAP and other data collection organizations, that somewhere around like 95% of the international humanitarian system is national and local workers. There are people like in the UNICEF relief operation I showed you before, who are caring for their neighbors and their countrymen in and outside relief operations. But this labor hierarchy, there are steep gradations in whiteness, in language. So from sort of the language of ethnic minorities and indigenous people, all the way up to sort of European languages of English and French. Then local staff carry the most risk. They often carry a lot of risk, and they are really essential to making relief operations work. But they typically have a very little job security, protection, pay, and benefits compared to expats like me. And they had very little relatively the capacity for international mobility. They couldn't sort of get visas or travel across borders in the same way that I was so easily able to. And partly as a consequence of that, they had so few career advancement opportunities. So, I took a really Marxist perspective in this part of the book. And I find that local aid workers in particular are alienated from the means of production or from the means of producing the aid that employs them, the aid that save lives in their communities and in their countries. And value always accrues upward within the international humanitarian system. So another thing that I was interested in looking at in the book is sort of this epistemology, the idea of what humanitarianism is, and as a way to help me methodologically. I am trying to use the word samafal, which is a sort of loose translation of humanitarianism or philanthropy or charity in the Somali language. And this is just a way to show that I'm trying to sort of learn from the ground up what humanitarianism means in a really different place and for different people. And so I'd like to talk about some of the important foundations, almost like the fundamental principles, not of the ICRC, but the fundamental principles and foundations of samafal. And you can really compare this to the Somali phrase, Bani Adam Nimada, which more narrowly indexes distributions of food aid from USAID, for example, or UNHCR setting up a refugee camp and enrolling people in assistance. That was talked about as Bani Adam Nimada, whereas samafal was more broadly sort of people caring for patients in clinics set up by Doctors Without Borders. It was parents caring for their children in droughts and helping them evacuate. It was sort of on marquees of relief organizations in Jigjiga and Gode and other places in the Somali region. It indexed in conversation a broader, sort of more loving, reciprocal, and expected way of caring for people in crisis. And I'll also say, like, what was interesting was that I think sort of grounding and centering this idea of samafal let me see how local aid workers, Somalis in Ethiopia, for example, they were tasked in relief operations with taking, these exotic, exogenous, narrow, often inappropriate, and very often bureaucratically encumbered, as Dr. Slim was talking about, sort of models of Bani Adam Nimada, these narrow relief operations, and they had to sort of, work with it and transform it into samafal, something that was sort of expected, that was loving, reciprocal, into something that in a broader linguistic sense for them was humanitarian. Okay, so here's some foundations of samafal. I'll go through these. I'm only going to mention 4. There are lots, but I'm going to talk about 4 that I found really important. The first one is interdependence, and really in contrast to humanitarian response conceived as temporary or unidirectional, like from Western donor countries, for example, to recipient countries, a transfer of goods and services given without any expectation of return or enduring relationship. Somalis centered this idea of interdependence, as well as part of this reciprocity and a really radical idea of the redistribution of resources. And there's a character in the book I call Dr. Hamza. And Dr. Hamza had been part of the Ethiopian government, the Somali regional government. He'd worked for big relief organizations and UN relief organizations. And he defined samafal for me with this following story. So this is quoted from him. This is what he told me. He said, "When I was a child in the bush, some families were broke. They had no camels, no money, nothing at all. At that time, early in the morning, our family would milk a camel, and then we would bring a container of that milk to the person's house. And the container would stay there at their house, just in front of their house. Many people would contribute milk to that same container, filling it all the way up. That family would then have more than enough milk. You see, it would be totally full, actually overflowing. And they'd be able to go to the next door, their neighbor, somewhere else, and share the milk from their full container with others. That's it," he said, "we share. That is how we have enough." So Dr. Hamza knew, and he said in conversations that we had at other times later about his family and his retirement from working, that if he ever needed assistance, if something ever happened to him personally or to his sort of natal family, that others would be there in his time of need as well to help him. So the second fundamental foundation of samafal, I would say, would be care. And this is a sort of compassionate, metaphysical, and religious form of care. In contrast, I think, to an idea of a dispassionate and distant form of the provision of materials and services from one place to another. And as so many Somalis did, they grounded it in their practice of Islam. So in the Quranic verse, part 2, section 22, verse 177, they talk about charity, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. The Holy Quran says to believe that it is righteousness to believe in God, to spend of your substance out of love for him, for Allah, for your kin, for orphans, for the needy, for the wayfarer, for those who ask, and for the ransom of slaves, to be steadfast in prayer and practice regular charity. So this samafal means providing loving care, but care that is given and received in the name of God, modeling and demonstrating to others the love of God. So Musa, a young Somali staffer at a European relief agency in Jigjiga, he said to me once, Allah will help the one who gives. If I have even one birr, which is like an Ethiopian dollar, I try to give it away to him, to the man in need. Most people do this. It is our culture. We share what we have. That is who we are. We're the same people, all of us, the same blood. And when you do this, the people will know. People would see if I was doing this work professionally and not living it. What you're doing and saying in the community, it has to be what you are. If I'm not practicing, they will know. You shouldn't go to a hotel. You should sleep there out with them, the recipients of aid, and then they'll know you're serious. So care was a religious tenet. It was interpersonal. It was enacted. But as so many expressed to me, it was also political. I met another person who was sort of helping run UN relief agencies, mobile teams of healthcare providers. And there was an outbreak of polio many years ago. And he told me this was the beginning of our mobile team effort. And I had to send my staffers who were sort of from, they were Ogaden from Jigjiga. They were sort of city kids in a way. They'd grown up in the regional capital. They were part of a really dominant sort of family group within the Somali region. And he had to send them out to the border, to the southern border with Kenya and Somaliland in order to provide care in those communities. And the guys were really hesitant to do so. They said, I don't think we want to go there. These are areas that are dominated by the Marahan clan, which is the clan. It was sort of this infamous, feared clan from which Siad Barre, the Somali nationalist dictator, he came from there. And these Ogadenis, they were like, I don't think we're welcome there. But Bashir, he really insisted that they go. He said, you must go. You must be present there. You must look the other people in the eye. It makes a difference. It makes a big difference. And he talked about after that sort of intervention, after a few weeks, these sort of relationships of distrust and fear, they fell to the wayside. People began to trust each other. They shared food. They shared khat, the mild narcotic leaf in the evenings. They talked with each other on mats under the stars. And it really helped with subsequent relief operations. After that, there was a measles outbreak and they sent people. After that, there was a drought and they sent people. And it created these sort of interclan, unifying relationships of solidarity between Somalis from really different political and kinship groups in sort of support of what the Somali regional government, with the support of the UN, what they were doing. So it was political too. Third, the third foundation is kinship. And lots of people, including anthropologists, like to talk, this British anthropologist in particular, sorry to pick on British, but it's the worst. There's this idea of Somalis being sort of xenophobic and sort of only loyal to their own clan, in English. But Somalis, in fact, have a really socially constructed and contingent idea of kinship that is not based on literal blood ties. I worked very often with Somalis in the northern Somali region, the Isa clan, and they sort of traced their lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad, like all different sort of kinship groups, Somali kinship groups. But the Isas, not everybody was blood related. There were founding fathers of the Isa clan, and 3 out of the 4 were related by blood to the father Isa, but the 4th was not. He was brought in a time of crisis and treated like a brother. He was adopted, they said. And that is kinship. I heard again and again, people use the Somali proverb that says, don't say the man was closer in blood to me, but say that he was good to me. People will not forget that. So that is the idea of kinship. And finally, you have the idea of solidarity and political action being really important to the idea of samafal. So samafal in Ethiopia, and this is a sort of more complex historical political story to unpack, but it wasn't just a way of interpersonal caring for people and helping people out of crisis. It was literally and materially, it was a mechanism of government for Somalis. It was a way to bolster the activities of the regional government and make the Somali regional government work. The Somali regional government is part of the ethnic federal state of Ethiopia, and they have sort of constitutional autonomy over budgets and over a lot of programming. And there, this is complex, it's problematic at times, but so much humanitarian aid was able to go in sort of without being sort of captured or controlled by the federal government in Ethiopia. It was directly to headquarters and offices in the Somali region that worked very closely with the Somali government. And so after so many decades of neglect at the hands of different Ethiopian governments, after decades of neglect by international development projects like run by the World Bank and so on, after so few private economic investments as well compared to other parts of Ethiopia, and after the sort of partition of the Horn of Africa that strategically divided Somalis between 4 different empires, the British, the Italian, the French, and the Ethiopian empire, Somalis will tell you, that international humanitarian aid, Bani Adam Nimada, helped to provide needed assistance to Somalis working with and within the government. So going back to Dr. Hamza, the doctor at the beginning, he said, today the governmental Somali Health Bureau here is 100% Somali. Most international NGOs are headed by Somalis now too. And 5 years ago, the heads of office were mostly either white or Highlander. And what he meant by this was non-Somali, Amharic-speaking Ethiopians from the center, north, or west of the country, who've always held power over ethnic minorities like Somalis. He said, this is a big change for us now, and it really helps us to be free. So in conclusion, what I want to highlight, in this book and today is that we need to recognize the power of multiple and alternative humanitarian epistemologies and ethical systems already at work, including samafal. But that we need to recognize that they were important in the Horn of Africa and the Somali region of Ethiopia. But I also think they're really important within the Red Cross in Geneva. And in USAID in Washington, DC, and this is something I'm wrestling with. Samafal isn't entirely alien or unfamiliar to me and to my colleagues who work in humanitarian response. Even American or European individuals, once they've donned a doctor's coat, a jacket with a red cross or a blue vest, signifying affiliation with a relief organization, don't truly act dispassionately or without political motives or political positionality. Often they're fighting for peace, democracy, justice, for people and causes they want to serve. And I loved the book that Dr. Slim wrote because he goes through so many examples of liberation movements and alternative sort of ethical frames that people are using. I was also thinking of the medics in Tahrir Square in Egypt, the white helmets in Syria, volunteers from Humane Borders leaving, water for migrants moving through the Arizona desert. And governments too. To whom does the US government or the EU or UN prioritize for humanitarian assistance? And what kinds of assistance do we provide? Are we really so neutral, impartial, apolitical, and independent of government or political motive? What's our response to, you mentioned Ukrainians seeking asylum, for example, versus Somalis from the Horn of Africa or Eritreans or Palestinians? We too respond to humanitarian crisis with politics and kinship and solidarity in mind. samafal, therefore, isn't just a Somali thing. I think it articulates forms and realities of humanitarianism that are really commonplace, that may be in some ways dominant, given the overwhelming number of local and national staff of the humanitarian system today. But while they're common and in some cases perhaps dominant, they're often ignored, or they're considered biased or corrupt or unprincipled. Somalis practicing samafal get called corrupt, biased, unprincipled, right? And I worry about the effects of that, reifying, cementing, those labor hierarchies that are already so racialized and inequitable. When are the principles that we're espousing, like neutrality, impartiality, when are they duplicitous or performative? I think it's a question worth asking. But alternatively, on the other hand, when are the fundamental principles and the idea of do not, when are they still vital? When is it really important to attend to the suffering of those we disagree with, or we have no geopolitical or strategic interest in, whose suffering isn't visible? Even people, as you mentioned, who may not hold the same democratic or other principles that we hold dear. And I thought, when is it important to listen again to Henri Dunant and his cries on the battlefield in Solferino, that I've read for so many years from Hugo Slim and others, of tutti fratelli, of all of us, all brothers. He's really crying out to us, all kin. And so perhaps we can learn from Somalis and their understanding of samafal, another facet and potential of humanitarianism. Rather than using our differences in kinship, as Somalis call it kabil, and politics to divide us, to be partial or biased or self-interested, perhaps we can and should understand kinship and government as something built through samafal, through acts of care, through being present with people in their times of crisis, like Bashir points out, and to build trust across geographic and cultural differences. And finally, through a recognition ultimately of all of our independence. And that's what I think I walked away with, having learned so well from Somalis. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So I would like to thank Lauren and Hugo for joining us today and for their fascinating commentaries. I thoroughly enjoyed reading both these books and appreciated how well they spoke to each other. I think each volume grapples with important questions related to the humanitarian industry and how we enact, perform, and practice humanitarian action. And I wanted to focus on three broad themes today that I drew from both books. So first is a focus on pluralistic forms of humanitarianism and how humanitarianism as an ideology, a practice, an industry, a profession, and a moral imperative is socially and subjectively constructed and understood in different ways. Slim examines the dynamism of humanitarianism through a broad historical overview of its evolution from Solferino on, as well as in relationship to the ever-changing forms of war and violence and our understandings of civilians and harm, which he didn't focus as much on today, but is about 2/3 of the book, and I found to be a very important discussion. Carruth focuses on how humanitarianism is understood in the Somali region and offers the idea of samafal, which has deeper meaning than official humanitarian policies and projects. Both challenge us to consider and see how our very Western understanding of humanitarianism produces a sort of policy myopia focused on formal systems, official mechanisms, professionalized practices, routines, and standards. By revealing these deeply embedded assumptions, both authors provoke us to contemplate what alternative forms of humanitarian action concurrently exist and how they address challenges like migration, climate change, and disease. And I'll add to that as someone who works within higher education, this is also a question that I grapple with, and I have some students in the audience, we grapple with this in our classes. Because what does it mean for us to be teaching humanitarian action and forming the next cadre of professionals, where we understand that in doing so, we're also very much feeding into some of these hierarchies and some of these myopias as well. And so we try to combat this in my classroom, but it's a challenge. Second, both books offer provocative discussion of the idea of governance, what it means in practice and how it is built, bolstered, and eroded through humanitarian activity. In their own ways, both Carruth and Slim discuss parallel systems of aid. In Colombia, for example, where there's weak central governance and rebel-controlled areas, systems of aid exist entirely outside the formal systems based out of Bogota. Carruth tells a similar story in the Somali region of Ethiopia. She tells a story of how Somalis in the Somali region exist at the margins of Ethiopian society and how humanitarian aid both contributes to their empowerment as providers of assistance, as well as their marginalization because Ethiopia does not contribute to these public services. Like Slim, she talks about how governance occurs in these fluid spaces with the state often as a peripheral actor. I agree that this can be a pernicious and unintended effect of humanitarian aid in that it disrupts citizen-state accountability chains. However, I also wonder whether this view is too state-centric, and perhaps the governance of the future reflects micro spaces where government-like actors provide social goods and services to constituents. In the section on war, Slim discusses rebel governance of urban or conflict areas. And I think if we look at Myanmar, we see these types of governance relationships in ethnic health organizations and how they work within specific areas of Myanmar to provide healthcare and other public goods and services. So I wonder if rather than thinking about this as displacing the state, these humanitarian actors are governing in a new way and creating different systems of governance and challenging the way we think about governance. Finally, both authors challenge us to consider whether humanitarianism, as is practiced in formal institutions of humanitarian action, is too complicated. Slim argues for a return to the simple and asks, why do we have ever complicated forms of aid? Is it really more effective than notions of samafal rooted in care, reciprocity, interdependence in ways that are both sentimental and political? And how essential is thinking about simple aid to tackling some of the looming problems we will face in the near future, from climate change to big wars to displacement and disease? So those are some of my thoughts, and I will open to both panelists to react to any of my comments as well as to each other for a few minutes. And then we already have many questions in the chat, so we can refer to those in a few minutes. So I don't know if anyone wants to respond to each other or to me.
I'm happy to start. So thank you, Maryam, for those 3 points. I really like your second one, actually, because I think it is very well observed and probably true. I think there's a profoundly sort of socialist, state-centric bias in humanitarian ideology and development ideology often as well, as you say, and therefore it expects that the telos, the end of positive development, will be a very big functioning welfare state, etc., etc. But of course, conservative theory would think differently, and actually so would a lot of Catholic social teaching too, would be much more in favor of, you know, subsidiarity and locally emerging forms of government, which, you know, take responsibility for their own lives, use their own agencies to provide public goods. So I think that's really helpful, and we should perhaps, you know, be much more aware of a mixed moral economy rather than this sort of binary between the state and the things which are not the state and therefore not really properly doing their job.
It's a really provocative question. And I mean, I have to say from my book, it's really sort of grounded in the reality of Ethiopia at the current moment, or in the last, 5 or 10 years, in which it is a holdover from a very centralized socialist dictatorship of, the 70s and 80s. And a really sort of authoritarian state, even after the revolution in 1991. And there was a lot of interest among Somalis in sort of capturing the resources available from humanitarian response to build a government, because the sort of regional government had relatively sort of less funding from the from Addis Ababa, from the capital, compared to other ethnic regions in the country. And so they had a sort of political interest in sort of building the state, and the state became a government that was for and about and of the Somali people. And I think it's important to read this within the long history, or the longer history of Somalis in the Horn, again, who were strategically partitioned in the colonial period, who had their lands and trade routes and religious pilgrimage routes all cut off from one another. And so it becomes not just a way of governing individuals, but a way of sort of knocking down borders in a way, and sort of unifying and liberating ethnic Somalis in the Horn. And so, it would be very different to study it in another place without that particular history. But I think it's an interesting case because of the way in which humanitarian relief was used to build the government, instead of a lot of the other mechanisms of foreign aid that goes to governments. Because they didn't get a lot of other funding. They didn't get development aid, for example, because no one has invested in long-term development projects in the Somali region. And so that's sort of all they had, was this crisis money that would come, the injections of it every so often. And sort of with that, they were trying to transform that imperfectly into something they could use to build the government.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that reminds me of something in Hugo's book about pragmatism. And increasingly, when I think about some of the work that I'm doing on NGOs and thinking about humanitarian governance, increasingly draws on this idea of creativity and pragmatism in sort of solving these problems. And I think in both of your books that comes out very vividly in terms of, how do we think about how public policy problems are solved, right? And they're not necessarily in these rational, instrumental ways, but sometimes it's just sort of making do with what you have and creating these different systems and webs. And I think our theories sometimes overlook much of that. So we do have some questions in the chat that I will ask. The first one is from Philip Taminga, who also says hello to the panelists. In the chat, he asks, can you both give any thoughts on the core humanitarian standard, which aims to describe how humanitarians need to be accountable to the people they serve and put people in the center? The 9 commitments originally started out as a dialogue with communities on what they want and expect from aid organizations.
You go first this time, Lauren.
I think it's a really interesting question, especially about accountability mechanisms. And one thing that was sort of coming to fruition that I could see happen was that more and more Somalis were leading the accountability mechanisms and leading the sort of research and monitoring and evaluation efforts that were happening in the Somali region. And that was really gratifying, I think, for people both in headquarters in mostly Europe and elsewhere. But it was really gratifying for Somalis. And, there's a really, there's a revolving door, so to speak, between relief organizations and the government and even private industry in Ethiopia. People move around in between. And so a lot of the sort of ideas held in the core humanitarian standard, as well as in sort of models for accountability mechanisms, it doesn't just stop with the particular relief organizations people are working for, because they take those ideas with them to the government. And you could really see an increase in capacity, and the vernacular of accountability was sort of filtering into the government, because so many of the leadership had been working for so long for these global organizations that prioritize those ideas and those forms of research and data collection, and community dialogue as well. So I was sort of seeing that have a really positive effect. It took a long time and it was piecemeal, but you could see its effects.
I must, Philip, it's nice to see you online. And I must say, I've never worked directly using the core humanitarian standard. And I'm very encouraged by what Lauren's just said, because I think that's very encouraging if it's got a sort of drip drip spreading effect in terms of political contract in various societies. I suppose my only reservation about these things is that they would be, in a sense, instruments of, further control and power, because the big NGOs with the money can come and sort of impose them and require them and administer them as instruments of accountability, which I think has challenges of its own and is in a sense part of the problem. But I would also agree, having listened to Lauren talking about samafal, I think probably a lot of their core values share universal ideas of what is a good way to help people, a good way to be with people and respect people. So my other reservation is that, from my experience in a big humanitarian bureaucracy, these instruments just proliferate the system. And a lot of the work becomes about creating new teams and making accountability a whole new department and division or whatever. And then, elaborating the bureaucracy much more. And it makes it more of a science rather than perhaps an ethical approach to work. That would be one of my reservations. But I'm pleased to hear if it is mobilizing a form of practical ethics on the ground.
Thank you. And I'll chime in here too, because this is my area of research, the accountability mechanisms. And I see a similar dynamic to what Lauren describes. So, and in some of my work, I argue that we tend to evaluate the humanitarian accountability mechanisms from an operational perspective. So we're always measuring to see, are we addressing complaints? Are we, do we have these feedback loops? And I argue in some of my work that we should consider it more as a normative mechanism rather than an operational mechanism, so normative coordination. And in that sense, we do see lots of transformations. If we think about the Sphere project, I was thinking about Sphere when I was reading Hugo's discussion of the expansion of humanity. The Sphere project in its very initial forms didn't even include gender or women as a specific category. And it's been expanded over time as our kind of notions of, who counts and, what types of programming should we be doing changes. Now, as Hugo argues in his book, this can also be an unintended consequences and not necessarily a good thing in terms of ever expanding notions of humanity and humanitarian aid. But I do think that they serve an important governance feature that does trickle down and sort of model these relationships. And oftentimes, I feel that we're not evaluating them for the right things. So we sort of focus very much on these technical operational aspects instead of sort of appreciating the normative value that they have in the sector. And I agree, obviously they lead to a lot of bureaucratization and reports and endless meetings and, all sorts of things. But that would be, sort of my take. There are other models now, I'm sure you're familiar with, Philip, like Loop, for example, that move the accountability mechanisms even closer to the people. So the Loop is sort of like a Yelp in a way, where people can provide direct feedback on organizations and then organizations have to respond. So I think there's different models, but I don't think we would have gotten to that place without the original mechanisms. So if we hadn't had HAP and we hadn't had Sphere and we didn't have the core humanitarian standard, I'm not sure we'd be having these conversations about accountability in the same way. So I think if we think about it in broader historical perspective, we can sort of see their contribution in terms of governance of the sector normatively. Sorry to co-opt, but that was like my one niche, it's my niche topic, right? Okay, we have a question from Emerson Roca, who says, beyond the two books presented today, which references should I look for? Should I look for ways to taxonomize types of humanitarian actors or type of groups of people, institutions, and so-called humanitarian crises?
Well, I'll take that just to dodge it, actually. So Emerson, I'm afraid you're asking the wrong person here, because in my, I hesitate to call it a career, but in my career, I've moved between academia and operational agencies all the time. And as a result, I'm not a very good academic anymore. And I really wouldn't know all the references you need to think about, who's written well on that and who's produced taxonomies and models and theories. But I imagine they're there somewhere.
I will say in my book, I get into sort of greater detail about the labor hierarchy. And at least for, the eastern part of Ethiopia, I try to sort of show a hierarchy that doesn't come out well. It's not a beautiful graphic, unfortunately, in the book, but it gets at the complexity. And there was a question in the chat about local NGOs. And a lot of that does involve the sort of labor and partnerships with local organizations, which I think are really vital. But yeah, as far as a greater taxonomy, I think it would also be really difficult because while the language of aid, whatever you want to call it, ADs, or, we have this nomenclature for sort of different types of posts, that those get translated differently in different contexts. And I think at least just from, I used to work in Addis Ababa for the most part, and then sort of moving to the Somali region, there was a really different understanding about sort of, who was program staff, et cetera. I was surprised that there was a diversity in use of common words by different organizations at sort of national headquarters or federal headquarters compared to regional headquarters. So it'd be a really difficult thing to do. But I think the more important thing for me is to really look at how, there's such gradations and inequity, and how how that taxonomy is sort of dominated by people at the very bottom, and how the people sort of comprising most of the industry or the humanitarian system have, so much less in the way of power, as well as sort of material benefits, pay, life insurance, et cetera. Those are really important things. And people's access to that is really inequitable across the taxonomy. And, this is something that I'm also wrestling with, as I teach and think about these things, because there's been all this focus on localization, and there's, especially after COVID, there's so many fewer expats who are traveling. And yet the other thing we hear about in the news all the time is attacks on aid workers. And, according to the humanitarian outcomes, the aid worker database, 95% of attacks on aid workers are to local and national staff. And this is probably only increasing with the war in Ukraine. And so what are we doing by sort of having more and more locals sort of be the people sort of staffing relief operations, and yet still not giving them the protection, the security details, the life insurance that they need? And at the same time, they aren't seen as neutral or impartial actors. They're seen as targets, and I'm sort of grappling, I'm not saying that, localization is causing increased attacks, or the challenges to humanitarian principles is causing the localization and an increase in attacks, but these are happening at the same time. And it worries me a lot for the safety and well-being of local actors.
Thank you. We have another question from Philip Tamanga. What a fantastic example from Somalia. Thank you. I see a lot of parallels from Indigenous First Nation ethical values in Canada and many Latin American countries, and the conversation happening there about integrating Indigenous knowledge into crisis responses. Any thoughts?
None from me, Philip. I really don't know about Native Americans and indigenous communities in Canada and things.
I don't see it like samafal as universalizing itself, other than I think it has a lot of resonance. I'm sure, like what you're talking about, with other sort of forms of humanitarianism translated differently. But I think it's really important to recognize sort of our own practice of samafal, you know, and how maybe that helps us understand Henri Dunant, you know, who was a sort of evangelical Christian of his day, who was involved in abolition movements, right? Like, I mean, he was sort of himself sort of a compassionate character, right? And to understand that from the history of humanitarianism all the way up to the present, I think it's important to index those things in our own work and in our own representation of humanitarian response.